This is a ManeHustle Media podcast.
It sounds like one of the names they would have for a monarch. It's like Queen Javia the First, Black Radical Queer, among queer Negro women.
All the way from the A, you listen to my favorite lesbian on BRQ.
Hey, stay locked in with your favorite lesbian on Black Radical Queer. Yeah.
Hey y'all, this is Javia Nicole, aka your favorite lesbian, and you're listening to Black Radical Queer Podcast, our stories on our own terms.
Hey y'all, welcome back to Black Radical Queer Podcast. I am your host, Javia Nicole. So I know I took a little break, and now I'm back. It was much needed. So today, I actually want to talk to you all about grief. So I know it's not fun and exciting, but it's very timely. It's just very timely. So I really want to look at... The reason I want to focus on grief is because as a Black queer woman, I experience grief in such a nuanced way. And for marginalized people in general, grief is a very nuanced thing, and we experience grief from the micro to the macro level. It's something that we're perpetually in this state of grief. So it's something I've been thinking about a lot. I had been thinking about it since last year because I, dealt with a lot of loss, and there was, not just personal loss, but community loss and things like that. So it's something I've been thinking about a lot, and something that I want to address because I think that we experience it in such a overwhelming way, and it's so encompassing. Like, we experience grief on so many levels that it can really we become like saturated with it. Okay, so that's why I want to talk about it, because it definitely is a part of, Black queer stories. Unfortunately, we do a lot of grieving. So what I want to talk about is kind of like just the experience of grieving as a Black person in general, grieving as a Black woman, grieving as a Black queer person, and then specifically grieving as a Black queer woman, because all of that really gives insight into all the nuances of what it's like to experience grief in this body, in these identities, in my experience. So as a Black person, we have, like on a previous episode, I talked about generational trauma. So that factors into our grief as well. So as Black people, we have a lot of what I would call communal grief that we experience on a regular basis. And it's one of the things that happens to be a byproduct of the oppression and the marginalization that we contend with on a regular basis. So as we just kind of go through our lives and we witness our people being targeted, being slaughtered, being murdered, being harmed, because grief isn't only relevant to death, but it can be relevant to any type of loss, whether that's a loss of life or a loss of dignity, a loss of autonomy, whatever, it may be, but, a response to some type of loss. So as we navigate through the world and we see all these images and all these stories and all these situations of people that where there's a loss, there's, losses that are taking place on the micro level in our personal lives, as well as on the macro level in our communities and in the world. And so we're impacted by this because there's a barrage of grief-provoking images that we're bombarded with. So We, may have some type of loss in our family. We may see the loss of someone due to police brutality. We may see someone who was harmed, assaulted, just all types of things. So, we're witnessing this on a daily basis. We're contending with this on a regular basis. So as we go through our lives, we're having to deal with, microaggressions. We're having to deal with racism. We're having to deal with everything that comes with being a Black person in this world, while also grieving. And we also have to understand that as we're going through this, there's a type of grief that's associated with oppression, because it's like we are perpetually, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, mourning the loss of this person that we don't get a chance to be. And what I mean by that is we don't get the opportunity to exist outside the context of oppression. So we end up mourning and grieving that as well, in subtle ways, or sometimes in not so subtle ways. So we have like just kind of that day-to-day, hour-to-hour grief that comes with, hey, I can't just live a regular life. Like, I have all these other considerations to factor in when I'm looking at like just living my life and just, doing what I have to do. But I have to, I can't just be free. I can't just be carefree. That's a better way to put it. So we have this loss of the ability to be carefree. And so that's a type of grief right there. And I thought that I was like the only person, like, I don't want to say the only person who felt that way, but I didn't know how to articulate it. I felt like, dang, there's this, carefree Black girl that I don't get to be because I have so much oppression weighing on me. Like, I have to be so careful and so cautious with my existence that I don't get to just be carefree. And as I talk to more people and I talk to other folks, folks will express feelings similarly, so that's a type of, so really it's kind of like I have to grieve or mourn the loss of that possibility because of the world that we exist in, that possibility of carefree, this carefree Black girl or carefree Black woman, not being able to see that come to fruition for real, because I may be able to have, not to say I can't have any happiness, but still there's always a layer or a level of cautiousness that we have to abide by. So there's that, just kind of general grief, like the grief that we contend with on a regular basis. But then there's also some of the specifics to grieving as a Black woman. So, in Black culture, Black women are the backbone of the family, of the community. And even though a man may be looked at as a head of household, still, that doesn't negate the importance of, the role that Black women play. And so when you have Black mothers and sisters and daughters seeing things that Black men go through, and I'm looking at it from this perspective specifically because not to say that Black women don't go through the same stuff, because we do. Black women are subjected to violence. Black women are subjected to brutality and all that kind of stuff. But culturally, it is Black women who hold space for Black men going through those things. So that's why that's its own like subset of grief, because it's Black women who en masse display this outpouring of support and camaraderie and love and grief for the things that Black men go through. And it doesn't happen on the same scale with Black men. So it's not something that I, in my experience, can look at and say that it's a cultural, a type of cultural grief. Like, I feel like there's a type of cultural grief that Black women specifically experience in regards to Black men that we go through en masse. And I can't say the same thing for Black men. So that's why I'm focusing on that specifically in terms of the grieving as a Black woman, grieving for the loss of Black men. And because the rhetoric is always, Black men are targeted, Black men are, persecuted, Black men are murdered. And that is absolutely true. It's just that on the flip side of that, Black women are as well. But that's not what the common narrative is. So that's why we don't have that cultural phenomenon of mass grief. So we don't have that cultural phenomenon of like Black men grieving for Black women en masse the way that Black women do for Black men. And that's a lot. It's a lot to carry, and it's ingrained, because the reality is, even when I don't want to, a lot of times, like, I may not necessarily want to grieve for, I can't even say don't want to. It's just, it's automatic. It's like I feel a way. When I see these things that Black men are going through and like them losing their lives, even when I've been totally mistreated, so even, though I've been through, stuff with Black men or whatever, I still grieve for them and mourn them and stuff like that. And so an example of that, and why I decided to go ahead and do this episode, because I've been thinking about it. I've been kind of, it's been racking my brain, and I'm just like, I need to go ahead and do it. So we had the recent murder of Nipsey Hussle. And so of course, I live in Los Angeles. I'm not from here. So my introduction to Nipsey was, I had heard of him, a little bit, but my introduction to him, like, for real, was more so when I moved to Los Angeles, because we just so happened to basically stay in the neighborhood. Like, his hood and where his store was, where he was murdered, is up the street from where my wife and I live. So, with the news of his murder, it brought to light for me. Well, I guess brought back to light, because it's something I had thought about before, but it just, made me think of how we have these people who can mean a lot to us, or who can have all this significance, or who can be a quote unquote pillar in the Black community. But then there's this contention in terms of their stance on Black LGBT people. And because Black queer people, because as Black queer people, we are on the front lines of every damn thing, it can put us in a very precarious and a very, what's the word I'm looking for? Just a very confusing and unfortunate position when we have a situation like, okay, well, here's this person who, I'm pro-Black and I support my people. And, here's a Black person who there are some things that he did that I felt like were positive, and I've gotten a chance to see the impact that he's had and gotten to know more about him since I live here. But, he also has homophobia to contend with. Right. So, that's something that, for me, as a Black woman, as a Black queer woman, I have to reconcile, because there's part of me that is mourning the loss of this man. And this is just one example, because there are definitely more people, but, this is just, Nipsey is just a timely example. But, I'm mourning on some level, like, the loss of this young man, this young Black man from the hood, who, as my wife put it, she said basically, like, he did everything that he was supposed to do. Like, you're supposed to, like, when you're from the hood, don't forget where you came from, give back to the hood, stay real, blah, blah, blah. So those things, he did those things. I feel like my wife hit the nail on the head, that he did those things. And he still lost his life. His life was taken. And so that really breaks my heart. That is heartbreaking to me. It really is. But I also have to reconcile that with the fact that there are, that he had some homophobia in his history or in his past or whatever. I don't know what his stance was when he died, but I do know, comments and stuff that he made, and, just him going through his process. And we don't know how much or if he would have continued to grow or anything because his life was taken. But that's the kind of thing that I have to contend with as a Black woman, as a Black queer woman, grieving for these men, because it's not just about my queerness, even just grieving for men in general who, for one, a lot of times would not necessarily keep that same energy for me. Not showing up on the front lines for me, not hitting the streets for me. And also who may be problematic, abusive, whatever, it's like just taking into consideration all the nuances, all the things that factor into the grief. So it's a very disorienting place to be in, to be like, okay, I recognize the things that this young man did. I started to pay more attention to him once I saw what he was doing. It wasn't until later on, I never knew that he said anything that was homophobic or anything like that, until later on, but, cause I wasn't following him that closely. I just was aware of what he was doing in the community, and I would see it from, actually living in the community. So yeah, but it's very heartbreaking to me, but it's also, it really puts Black queer folks in this weird position because we do a lot of work for our people. And when we look at movements for Black people, Black Lives Matter, or any type of revolutionary movements, Black queer people and Black women are often on the front lines. We will step up first and literally put our bodies on the line. And so we have this outpouring of support that we give that we do not receive. And so it makes it a very difficult position to be in. So I was reading this article in Out magazine, and it was written by their executive editor, Raquel Willis, who I actually know from doing like some movement work in Atlanta. I don't know her like well or anything like that, but I just know her from us kind of knowing the same people and doing some social justice work and stuff when I was living in Atlanta. So she wrote this article, and it was called LGBTQ People Deserve to Feel How They Want About Nipsey Hussle, right? And so she has this quote that I pulled from there that just really stuck out with me, because it really applies to me in terms of like how I feel about just about being a Black queer woman, mourning Black men, mourning Black people who may or may not keep that same energy for me, who may or may not care about my existence the way I care about them. It's rough to care, to have so much care and love and all that for your people, and to not get that same energy in return. All right. So anyway, but this quote that she said, that I pulled from her article. So she said, "Our community and society at large is in what I like to call the era of reckoning. We're reckoning with our capacities to both oppress and be oppressed. We're reckoning with being held accountable for our past sins and how we plan to hold others accountable for theirs. We're reckoning with the impossibility of perfect politics. Why, even when we try our best, we will never be completely unproblematic." I like that particular quote because it really speaks to me in terms of like how I approach life as a Black radical queer person who is like about that life in terms of being on the front lines and down for her people, but also who is subjected to the oppression of men and heterosexual people. And it's, it stuck out to me because when she says, we're reckoning with the impossibility of perfect politics, why even when we try our best, we will never be completely unproblematic. I always keep that in mind. We all are problematic in some kind of way. We all have stuff that we have to unpack and unlearn and reprogram. We all have reprogramming we have to do. And so I know that, culturally, we're in this time where people are like, cancel this person, cancel that person, throw them away, and that type of stuff. Like that's kind of how we're approaching things. It's not a, restorative framework or transformative. None of that. It's like, this person, got to go to the trash. And while I respect everyone's autonomy to navigate, that how they choose, but for me, it's incredibly difficult for me to immediately throw people away, throw Black people away for being problematic. It absolutely depends on what it is. And it absolutely depends on if they make any effort. But it's not my automatic reflex to be like, you're canceled unless it's specific circumstances. Now, there are some circumstances where I'm like, you are fucking canceled, period. If you are a predator, if you are a pedophile, so predator covers all that. But, if you are a rapist, a pedophile, you out here, just being predatory, then yeah, I can let you go. Like, and, feel no pain, because you got to go. Like, for somebody like R. Kelly, I can't hold space. I cannot and I will not hold space for R. Kelly or Bill Cosby or, fucking predators. I ain't holding space for you. However, if the circumstances are different, then I can be more flexible. But it's on a case by case basis. I will say, of course, like, I'm a lot more flexible with Black people than I am with anybody else. And I'm most flexible with Black women. I hold the most space for Black women in regards to their growth and reconciling problematic behaviors and unpacking problematic shit. Okay, so, but at some point I will let you go. So an example of that for me would be like Just Hilarious. Now, I'm not particularly like tied to Just Hilarious. Like, I'm not, invested in her comedic career or anything like that. I know of her. I used to follow her on Instagram. I unfollowed her after she said something transphobic. And I'm like, okay, let me just periodically see if she's going to get her shit together. And then she, had this latest fiasco, with, when she was on her flight or whatever. So now I'm just like, okay, once I see a pattern of you just like you're problematic and it seemed like you just, content with that is your prerogative. But then I can make that decision to let you go. Right. And for some people, but at the same time, I recognize that none of us are perfect. I recognize that I have and I had in the past and have currently things I have to unpack. And so I hold space for that, particularly for Black people and especially for Black women. And so I know other people who do not. And I feel like that's totally up to them. Just like I know people who they say like they don't educate white people. I'm one of those people. I'm over it. I'm not your teacher. I'm not in the business of intentionally educating white folks. Now, if you happen to, luck up and get something like, learn something from something I post or something I say or whatever, fine. But I'm not going out of my way or making it my mission to educate white folks. I don't hold space for white people. So that's just, I feel like they have enough people and entities to hold space for them. So they don't need my Black ass to hold space. Like, I don't need to do that. Right. So I understand because that's my perspective. For me, with Black people, with people of color and with Black people, especially, I'm a little more forgiving. And I'm, excuse me. more willing to hold space. But that doesn't mean I hold it forever. I do not hold space forever. But at least I will hold space. And what I mean by hold space is leave that room for this person to unpack certain things and to break out of their problematic habits or ways of thinking, for them to grow. It's leaving room for that person to grow and for them to learn, because, we all have our past to contend with. We all had things we had to learn, and I'm not woker than thou. I'm not like, I'm just the wokest of the woke. No, we're all on a journey. I know my biases. I know, that I have my stuff I have to unpack. And then I also know my stuff that I'm not going, I know it's a bias and I'm okay with it, and for some people, they choose not to hold space for me. They're like, oh, you're too radical. Like you're way too radical for me. I can't, that's perfectly fine. That is your prerogative. Right. So, but yeah, so I think that it just knowing that for me personally and other people, some people that I've talked to, knowing that it's like, hey, you're holding space for people who, either may or may not do the same for you, or who may never get to the place to do the same for you. Because holding that space is like, I'm giving this person the opportunity to do the same for me, to get to a place where they can do the same for me. But that's with the understanding that they may never get there, or they may not want to get there. And so once I realize that either they don't want to be there, or they're not there in a time frame that I feel like works for me, then I can, let it go. But I try to be a little flexible, but not so much so. I have some space for people of color, not as much as I do for Black people, because I'm Black and because, anti-Blackness exists in every damn culture. So I always hold the most space for my people. But yeah, that space can be closed off. It can definitely be closed off. But the thing is too, so I look at like this whole concept of like grieving, being a Black woman, grieving Black men who may or may not, keep that same energy for me, being a Black person, just grieving, as part of the Black experience, as part of our cultural trauma, our communal trauma. And then I look at being a Black queer woman, and the way that even within our community, even within Black queer spaces, there's still a hierarchy of priority. Like there's still a hierarchy of what situations get the priority. So just because it's queer people, there's still some of the issues still mirror the issues in larger society. So like patriarchy. So in Black queer community, the something that arises with a Black queer man may get more spotlight, more shine, more attention, more mourning, more grief, more whatever, seen as more important than the plight of a Black queer woman. And so an example of this, especially a recent example, is with the situation of Jussie Smollett. So with Jussie, when folks found out that he was attacked, there was like an outpouring of, of course there was people who was on some other shit, but ultimately there was an outpouring of love and support and all that type of stuff, calls to action and, people demanding justice and stuff like that, that happened among, just kind of Black folks in general and also Black queer people. And the way that happened with Black queer people is not something that we don't see it happen to that same degree if the victim is a Black queer woman, a Black trans woman. We don't see that same energy. So, and that's really disheartening to me because, as a Black queer woman, we really are at the bottom of the totem pole. Black trans women, and, Black women in general, we're at the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to support and, kind of like our community surrounding us and covering us and protecting us and things like that. So, and again, I had I've been doing a lot of reading. So, and I didn't even realize until I got ready to record that I read another article and I didn't realize that it was by the same person. So it's a quote from a different article by Raquel from Out magazine. And so Raquel was talking about a Black trans woman who was murdered and just kind of how it made her feel. And so she used that as a segue to talk about what happened to Jesse. So I'll just read this quote because I just feel like, again, she hit the nail on the head. She said, "The despondency I felt when Gibson was murdered," so she's referring to China Gibson, who was a Black trans woman who was murdered. The despondency I felt when Gibson was murdered was similar to what I felt when news broke that Empire star Jussie Smollett had been assaulted early Tuesday morning. Though I was used to the Black LGBTQ community raising up these heinous acts, this time I witnessed the general public offering up their concern and desire for accountability and progress. It was encouraging to see deep discussion on how white supremacy especially threatens Black queer people. But throughout the day, I was also reminded of all the times that many of the same folks who were speaking out for Smollett had been silent when scores of our Black transgender sisters were attacked or murdered. And that, for me, I think that sums it up. We don't get that same energy. we just don't. We don't get that same energy. So it's relevant to grief because it adds more nuance to grief as a Black woman, whether, Black trans woman especially, but Black women in general. It adds another layer or more nuance to our grief because we witness the things that are happening to Black people in general, and we could be on the front lines of things and all that, but we pour out so much more energy and care than we receive. It's a very difficult thing to reconcile, right? So as a Black radical queer person, I'm about my people. I want to be about my people. And, I want to do what I can to see the liberation of my people, all my people, not just Black queer folks, but all my people. But, I also have to deal with on a regular basis the reality that my quote unquote people, my skin folk, all of them don't want that for me. All of them do not include me, include us, include Black queer folks, include Black trans folks. All of them don't include us in their vision of Black liberation. My vision of Black liberation is for all my people, but that's not, all my people don't agree. A large contingent of my people would be totally fine for me to not be included in that vision of liberation. So as someone who, is actively invested, all in for Black liberation and for revolution, that is a very difficult thing to acknowledge, to accept, and to deal with, and to figure out how to navigate. Like, what do I do with that? So that adds more nuance to my grief. That adds more nuance to our grief because, I can be fighting and doing everything I can and grieving, but also grieving the fact that, like, hey, I'm not getting the same thing in return, and really having to decide, like, what to invest in and what not to invest in. What am I how can I still show up and be my authentic self and fight for this, be actively engaged in this fight for liberation, which is very important to me. How do I do that and still protect myself and still do what I need to do for myself, because I understand that everybody is not for me. I might be here for them and they're not here for me. It really, it sucks. Honestly, it really is it adds this other element of grief, of sadness, because it does make me sad. It makes me sad that, I can be down to ride, down to fight and all this kind of stuff for people who may not. And so that's why you see so many people divesting from that, and so many people who are like, hey, I'm not doing this anymore. And so with the death of Nipsey Hussle, and just with other things that happen, you'll see a lot of Black queer folks who are like, hey, I'm not invested in this, or I'm not grieving this, or I'm not mourning this person because, hey, they would not have given a damn about me. That is completely valid. That's completely valid. And there are many instances where I feel that way. There are situations where I'm like, you know what? I'm not invested in this. I'm not, like, I got to separate myself because this person was not here for me. This person, would not have kept that same energy for me. But I can also admit that that's difficult at times. It's a hard, kind of line to balance on, just a hard thing to deal with, because I know how I feel about my people. And so that still exists. Like, I want for us to be free. I want for us to be liberated. I want for us to be able to live our best lives and to break the chains of oppression and all those kind of things. Knowing that I want that, it's hard to, I can't be completely not invested. Now, for some folks, yeah, like I said about predators and stuff, fine. But when it's a situation of, hey, I know I gotta like choose myself over this movement or being involved in this, like for instance with Black Lives Matter, I think I mentioned on the show on here before where, me and my wife were at a Black Lives Matter demonstration, and then some guy told me like, oh, it's so nice to see Black women out here for Black men or something like that. And I'm just like, this is what the fuck we do. Are you kidding me? Like, y'all need to show up for us. This is what we do. So it really just, it's like going into it with that understanding, like mourning for my people, grieving my people, but also knowing that I'm just not getting that. I'm not getting it to the same extent. It's very hard. So in the case of Nipsey Hussle, even though I know plenty of Black queer people who are like, hey, he was homophobic, so it's a no for me. I get that. That's their prerogative. For me, it's difficult for me to do that with him. I'm not someone who, I have not gotten to a place, and I don't know if I'll get to a place where I can just, with one fell swoop, just across the board blanket, cancel everybody. Now, some people, yeah, your ass to get, I'm done with you with quickness. But for some people, it's a little more complicated than that. And for some situations, for me, it's a little more nuanced than that. And in the case of Nipsey Hussle, I absolutely do not condone homophobia. Like, I don't think that's okay or anything like that. I don't give him a pass or anything. But I also have to acknowledge and admit, like, that even as a Black queer person, it still made me feel some kind of way. It still made me grieve to know that his life was taken. Like, just even understanding, homophobia and all that, it didn't make me happy at all. It didn't make me feel better. That's not a victory. It still broke my heart. It's still devastating to me that he's no longer here. So that's a very interesting thing to have to like wrap my mind around, and to kind of like to know like, hey, this person had these things that were problematic. This person said these things or whatever. Knowing that, not condoning that, and also still acknowledging and leaving room for the grief or the mourning and the care. Like, I just, yeah, I mean, for me, I'm not able to, with him, it's a situation where I'm not able to not care. It's just, it impacted me. And for something, it's like, I don't necessarily know what will and won't. Another situation was like with Sandra Bland. When I found out about Sandra Bland, it definitely had an impact on me. It absolutely had an impact. And I mean, I cried, all of that. And then later on, somebody was saying, oh, she said these homophobic things. I couldn't even with that knowledge, I don't know if it's true or not. Like, I don't, whatever. But when people said, oh, she said homophobic stuff or whatever, it's not like my grief just cut off. That did not like cut. I'm just not in that place. And I know other people who aren't in that place. I know people who are. I know people who are just like, you know what, like, it's a wrap, you're canceled or whatever. But I recognize that for me, because my blackness does come first. Of course, I'm queer. It is what it is. But it's, I don't know, in terms of like my identity, for me, I always say my blackness comes first, because that's what has the biggest impact. My blackness has a bigger impact on my life than my queerness. My queerness is absolutely important. It is next in line, but my blackness impacts my life. It literally colors my life in a way that my queerness does not. Because the reality is, I can't pretend to not be black, but I can pretend to not be queer. Like, if I absolutely needed to, but ain't nothing I can do to not be black. Right. So for me, it's just something I struggle with. So with Nipsey Hussle and with Sandra Bland, even with understanding like, hey, they were problematic in this way. That doesn't, for me, it doesn't, negate that, the impact that it had on me. It doesn't negate that grief, just being hit with like the reality of like, hey, their lives were taken. It still bothers me. It still frustrates me. It still breaks my heart that that those things happen to them. And so I don't know, maybe that makes me a bad queer person. I mean, but it's just me being honest. And that's why I say, for Black queer folks, the grief is so nuanced. I wish that I could just cut it on and off. Lord knows. I wish I could cut it on and off, but I can't. And so even with that knowledge of, those things, I don't know if they would have changed or grown or unpacked some things because their lives were cut short. I have no idea what would have happened, and I don't know I don't know if they were doing any work to unpack that stuff. But I know that even with the knowledge of how they were problematic, that still doesn't take away how I feel about their lives being taken as a Black person. Like, I still have that level of like grief and mourning for them. So yeah, it's just something that's been really on my mind a lot, because I think grief is it's something that, of course, not something that people like to talk about, but it's reality. And I think marginalized people experience it in a very different way, or in a more nuanced way. And I think as a Black queer person and as a Black queer woman, that also specifically, impacts my grief, and like the different ways that I experience grief, and the fact that, we can be grieving on multiple levels. Like, I'm grieving on the micro level for people close to me that are gone. I'm grieving on the communal level, the macro level for these people that, like Sandra Bland, like Nipsey Hussle, who I don't, who are not personally connected to me, but still feel connected to me through my Blackness. But then I have people who I'm just like, nah, I ain't fooling with you because, you're predatory. So, yeah, I guess for me it's levels. I don't automatic, like some stuff is at the level of you get that automatic cancellation, and some things I'm willing to hold space for you or leave a little room for you to grow. That doesn't mean I'm going to be like a cheerleader or anything, but I can, hold space for you. And if you come around, fine. And if you don't, I can let you go. And with, Nipsey Hussle, with Sandra Bland, and like folks like that, it just never, when they passed or whenever, like, or based on what I knew about them up to that point, I still was holding a little space for them. And I just never got to see what happened. We never got a chance to see what they would have unpacked, or if they would have grown more and changed some things had their lives not been taken. So, yeah. Okay, so I think I've talked enough about grief. Hopefully, hopefully if it's something that you've been thinking about, then you won't feel alone. I know that, everybody has their different ways of processing, their different ways of thinking about things, but it's just what's been on my mind, and I really wanted to share it with you all, especially now because I'm right up in the in the midst of a lot of grief, and I know I'm not the only one. And I've been talking to other people, and once I talk to other people who, other Black queer folks who are like, yeah, going through this stuff with grieving, I'm like, let me just go ahead and at least share, and I hope that it resonates with someone, and that someone can feel less alone, more understood, and just know that we out here, like, you're not alone in that grieving and that mourning. All right, y'all. I know that's a somber note to come back on, but of course I always keep it real with y'all, and that's where I'm at. So I'm just coming to you as I am. I appreciate that y'all fuck with me. And until next time, that's basically it, y'all. Thank you for tuning in. I'm out. Black Radical Queer Podcast is all about intersectionality and Black queer folks sharing our stories on our own terms. We navigate an array of identities, and BRQ is an outlet where we can see the spectrum of those identities reflected, explored, and celebrated. Black Radical Queer is a ManeHustle Media podcast hosted by Javia Nicole, produced and edited by Charmaine Johnson. Music is by Publicity. You can find us on social media by looking up Black Rad Queer. It's BLK RAD QWR. We are on Facebook as well as Instagram and Twitter. Same handle regardless, at Black Rad Queer. BLK RAD QWR. We also have a Facebook discussion group that's just called BRQ Discussion Group, and you can also listen wherever you get your podcasts. So we're on iTunes, we're on Spotify, Google Play, all those types of things, and we have our home base that's on Libsyn, so you can listen on there as well. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. Make sure you come on back around next week to see what we have for you, and all right, y'all, I'm out.
ManeHustle Media. Turn your side hustle into your main hustle.